Good afternoon, good evening, I suppose, depending on where you are in the world. And welcome to the American Conference of Irish Studies and today's virtual book talk. We're going to be discussing two recently published books that focus in different ways on the Irish and the British left. My name's Sinéad Kennedy, and I teach in the English department at Maynooth University, and I'm going to be moderating today's discussion. And we have the authors and editors of these two books that I'm going to introduce now in a second, who are going to give you a kind of an outline of each of their books. And then we're going to open it up for discussion. You can, at any time as you're going along, if a kind of question pops into your head, feel free to pop it into the Q&A box, which should be at the bottom of your screen there on the right-hand side. And we'll take the questions at the end after everybody's had a chance to contribute, and hopefully we can get a little bit of a discussion going. And we'll try and get through as many questions as possible. So I'm just going to start off by maybe just tell you a little bit about the two books and our authors and editors here today. So I'm going to begin with Aidan Beatty, who teaches at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He's the author of Private Property and the Fear of Social Class, as well as Masculinity and Power in Irish Nationalism. And that book was awarded the James S. Donnelly Senior Prize. He's written for Jacobin, for the Irish Times, the Washington Post, and many other publications. And he's currently president of the American Conference for Irish Studies. And the book by Aidan that we're going to be discussing today is The Party is Always Right, The Untold Story of Gerry, Healy and British Trotskyism, which was published just late last year by Pluto Press. And if you haven't had a chance to read it, it's available both as an ebook and as a paperback, which you can buy directly from your local independent bookshop or from Pluto Press directly. We're trying not to make the world's richest man any richer by shopping on Amazon. So The Party is Always Right, the central figure in what is quite a kind of fascinating and compelling narrative is Gerry Healy, who I never actually knew until I read Aidan's book, was actually born in Ireland, in Galway in 1913. But he lived most of his life in England, where he led a series of small Trotskyist groups like the Club, or I suppose the one that he was most well known for was the Workers' Revolutionary Party. And in the book, Aidan fashions this compelling and I suppose ultimately tragic story of the history of British Trotskyism. We have a story that's racked with accounts of abuse, collaborations with the state, and quite vicious infighting. But by focusing on this figure of Gerry Healy, you might think, why structure a book on British Trotskyism around a figure like Healy? I think Aidan is able to tell a story of broader relevance, and I think particularly important relevance for today. The story of how movements that, people join out of passion and sincere commitment, but often out of a deep sense of commitment, I suppose, to equality and justice, can end up kind of creating these monsters, becoming the opposite of the thing that people are fighting for. And there are many examples of that in our own world. And I think there's an awful lot of important lessons that we can learn as people who are at this really kind of important juncture, trying to build movements to fight for a better world in our own countries, but also, of course, for justice, and particularly want to kind of maybe just take a moment to remember the horror and genocide that's unfolding in Gaza, despite the so-called ceasefire. Our second book then is a collection of essays that's focused on the Irish left, and it's edited by both Oisín Gilmore and David Landy, who've joined us here today. And the book's called Fragments of Victory, The Contemporary Irish Left. And it's just been published again by Pluto Press and available in your independent bookshops and directly from Pluto. Oisín is a senior economist at TASC, which is the think tank for action and social change. He's based in Dublin, in Ireland. And Oisín has participated in many of the social movements, not only here in Ireland, but also in Britain and across Europe. And I think his long commitment to activism is very much reflected in the book. David is somebody I've known for many years, and we've worked together on many campaigns over the years. David's an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology at Trinity College Dublin, and he's also the director of I think one of the kind of first MAs, I think, in Ireland to focus on questions about race, ethnicity, and conflict. He's written for sociology, for ethnic and racial studies and social movement studies, on water charges movement, Irish anti-racism, and Palestinian solidarity. He is the author of Jewish Identity and Palestinian Rights and co-editor of Enforcing Silence, Academic Freedom and Criticism of Israel. And Dave is also a major figure in the Ireland-Palestine solidarity campaigns, and has organised over, not just recently, but over many years, a lot of the really important solidarity in Ireland for Palestine. Oisín and Aidan, as well as being talented academics and researchers, are both deeply committed activists who've devoted much of their time and energy to fighting for justice and a better world. And I think this really allows them a really unique perspective on the Irish left, because they obviously offer a kind of critical eye on the Irish left, but they're also shaped by the Irish left, and they've been part of kind of building many of the movements that they describe. And I think that's they allow us a kind of really kind of insider's perspective, but also, of course, a critical one. And I think that's reflected in the choice of contributors to their collection, which is like a roll call of many of the kind of most important committed activists in Ireland. Oisín and David's book, I think, argues against what they see as a kind of prevailing culture of pessimism among the Irish left. So Fragments of Victory charts many of the important political currents that happened in Ireland after the economic crisis of 2008, from the kind of very difficult years of the anti-austerity movements through to this very successful and important mass campaign to end water charges and prevent privatisation, through to campaigns like repeal, marriage equality, and kind of finishing off looking at the current ongoing struggle around housing in Ireland. And the book looks at things, it's got kind of this dual structure that allows you to see, to understand the campaigns themselves, but also, I think, and this is where I think it kind of chimes very well with Aidan's work, thinking about the organisations that have shaped and contributed to these campaigns. So I think there'll be quite interesting and important crossovers there that hopefully we can bring out in discussion. So I'm going to hand it back to Aidan, who's going to talk for about 15 minutes or so about his book, and then we'll hand it over to David and Oisín, who've kind of divided up their time, and they're going to talk about, I suppose, their own perspective, but also the individual essays in the book. So I'll hand it over to you, Aidan.
Thanks, Sinead, and thanks for that introduction, and thanks to the people who are joining us online. You know, if Oisín and David's book is about a certain amount of hopefulness, there is a kind of a grimness to what my book is about. So I thought I'd maybe start by talking about this man, Gerry Healy, who I think this is quite obvious from the way Sinead was talking about him, was not the most likable of people, to kind of give an understatement about him. So I'll talk a little bit about why I decided to write about him, and then maybe move on to sort of the larger arguments that I'm hoping the book is making. So I'm a historian by training, and for a few years I was writing various things on Marx and Engels and their writings on Ireland. So that book, Private Property and the Fear of Social Chaos, that Sinead mentioned, like there's a chapter in that about Marx and Engels and how they viewed Ireland and how their perception of Ireland was bound up with their perceptions of race and gender and historical development and the development of what they saw as the transition from feudalism towards capitalism, and how all of their discussions of Ireland were discussions of those things. Um, so some of that is like fairly obscure, and it's of interest to people who are really interested in Marx and Engels, but maybe not to too many other people. But in sort of doing that work, and particularly looking at Engels and the various things he wrote on Ireland, it's sort of impossible to do that without recognizing the fact that Engels had actually a lot of personal connections to Ireland, particularly through two women that he had ongoing relationships with, one of whom he formally married just before she died, both of whom were sisters. And so when I was doing that work, I became very interested in this story of these two women, and then started looking into them, and sort of had that kind of lucky moment as a historian where you realize like this is a really interesting thing and no one's written about it, so now I can write about it. So I wrote this article that came out maybe in 2021, but I had been working on it maybe from 2019 onwards, on the Burns sisters, these two women that had relationships with Engels. And I was interested in it just because it is just an interesting story in and of itself. But it also kind of gets into a really basic problem of historical methodology, that these are two women who are living adjacent to two of the most uh, literate men of the 19th century, and yet we know almost nothing about them directly from themselves. They were both illiterate, so we can never actually hear their voices in any historical record. We can only ever hear what other people thought about them. And so I was interested in like how much can we actually know about them, um, given that there's a whole lot of records about them, but none of the records are written in their own hand. So it's a really good example of what E.P. Thompson, the British historian, famously called the enormous condescension of posterity. So I finished that in 2019, and then was kind of looking for something similar to do, some other like little project like that would be a project about historical methodology, but also maybe gets into some of my own actual research interests about the history of socialism and gender history and things like that. And I kind of landed on Gerry Healy as a person to write about that. So he was a person that I had been vaguely aware of for quite a while. I knew some kind of basic things about him. Maybe most importantly for me, at least, was that I knew that he was from Galway, and I'm from Galway, and I thought this was just an interesting thing that there was this leader of various Trotskyist groups in Britain who was actually from Galway. And I knew there was some kind of sexual abuse scandal that he'd become involved with in the mid 80s, and then that there were very weird accusations that he'd been taking money from the Libyan government in the 1970s and 1980s. So I started doing work on this in early 2020, not really knowing where it would go, but just knowing like this will be an interesting story that I can explore, and it'll lead to something, like maybe a journal article or just some kind of piece of journalism. And then by March of 2020, it was obvious that I wasn't going to be leaving my house for about a year, or at least now in hindsight, I can tell that. So as I was kind of lucky enough to have a job where I can stay working from home, basically doing research on Gerry Healy became a kind of a hobby of mine over the early years of the pandemic. And sort of a great thing, at least for me as a historian, about Trotskyists is that they take their history very seriously. And so it's not that hard to find online archives of Trotskyist material. There's a man called Rob Marsden who runs a website called Splits and Fusions, where he very tirelessly catalogs and scans and puts up online a huge amount of Trotskyist material, like newspapers and pamphlets and handbills and things like this. So I was able to still do a lot of the basic work of being a historian while being stuck at home. And so this project that I was doing on Gerry Healy just kept kind of growing and expanding over 2020 and 2021. And it got to the point where I realized this was more than just a journal article, that this might be actually a short book. And then it became a slightly longer book as I did more on it. And as it developed, I wanted to use the book to explore some of those kind of methodological questions. What can you truly know about a person like Gerry Healy, who, even when he was alive, was incredibly divisive, and people either felt he was the greatest figure on the British left or felt he was a violent thug and a sexual abuser. And that divisiveness has really only grown in subsequent years. And then the other thing I started to explore as I was working on this was, what does this story actually say about Leninism as a political movement or as a kind of political project, and about Trotskyism as a variation of Leninism. So one of the things I started to really think about was, what is there a connection between structuring a party in a very rigid and in the case of Healy, quite authoritarian way, and the actual abusiveness that took place. And maybe it's not the most groundbreaking of arguments, but my conclusion is there is a connection there, that if you have a party where you can't criticize the leadership, and the party leadership will always close ranks to defend itself, that is a party that is really kind of incubating a person like Gerry Healy, in terms of the sexual abuse that he carried out for quite a few years within the party. And prior to all of this, I had mainly worked on 19th and 20th, early 20th century Irish history. And now I was doing a project where there were actually some people still alive, quite a few people still alive who were involved in this. So oral histories became something that I could get involved with this. And early in the course of doing this, I came across a book called Young Lies on the Left by Celia Hughes, which is a really quite smart and reflective and self-reflective work on the use of oral histories for how left-wing people remember their own past. So there was a really obvious value of oral history for a project like this. As I started to work on it, I had a list of maybe 10 people that I thought I could interview. And then when I approached Pluto Press about publishing it, they said they would like to see me at least do 40 to 50 interviews, which at the time I thought there's absolutely no way I'm going to be able to get 40 to 50 people like talking on the record about this. I ended up just, I think, breaking 40 or slightly above 40 people willing to talk to me, who had some kind of involvement with the Socialist Labour League, which was the group Healy led in the 1950s, or the Workers' Revolutionary Party, the group he led from 1973 to 85. And so as I finalized all this, then I ended up writing a book that is partially structured quite conventionally and chronologically as a biography of Gerry Healy. So I start with his early life. He was born in Ireland in 1913. I recounted as much as we can possibly know about his childhood, and then followed him as he moves to Britain in the late 1920s, became involved first with the Communist Party, and then with a series of different Trotskyist groups from the late 1930s onwards. I looked a lot at his leadership of the Socialist Labour League in the 1960s. This is really his first formal leadership role in a formally open existing organization. And they're a small group, but they're actually a fairly well-known force on the British radical left at a time in the early 1960s where, in terms of just large-scale organized left-wing parties, the only other options other than the Socialist Labour League are the Labour Party and the Communist Party. So if you are a person who feels the Labour Party are too moderate and capitulatory and feel the Communist Party are too Stalinist, at that period at least, your only real other option for an actual existing political organization is the Socialist Labour League. And then I move with Healy into the Workers' Revolutionary Party, which is really the group that he's best known for, and I give them more attention really than any of the other groups that he was involved with. And all of this then is leading up to 1985, when there are shocking revelations that come out about Healy's sexual abuse of female members of the party. And in the summer and into the autumn of 1985, the Workers' Revolutionary Party just tears itself apart in recriminations over what had actually happened. And then I conclude with what is effectively the aftermath of all this. Like, where do Healy and other members of these groups end up? And where do his followers end up politically? But then across the whole book, I intersperse this with alternating chapters about broader issues related to how political parties are structured and how very hierarchical party structures carry the danger of empowering people like Gerry Healy. I look a lot at the gender and racial politics of the group. I think more so the gender politics and the racial politics, and the way in which the party actually had this very masculinist ethos of kind of heroic self-sacrifice for the party, up to and including like putting yourself, almost like self-sacrificing yourself for the party, and how that becomes part of their abusiveness. I look at a lot at their relationship with the British state and claims that the party was infiltrated by various intelligence services and police. And my goal here in sort of structuring it this way was to hopefully get away from a purely micro-historical study focusing just on Gerry Healy, but to ask much larger macro-historical questions. I'm happy to kind of come back to any of this if people have questions, but I'll stop there and hand it over to David and Oisín.
Thanks very much, Aidan. So I'll let David and Oisín structure their own time there. So
Okay,
off you
thanks,
go.
Aidan. Thanks, Aidan. Thanks, Aidan, for organising this all. Um, so yeah, how we want to structure our time is sort of based on the original title of the book that we had, which was about the successes and failures of the Irish left. And what I'll do is I'll speak about the successes for about 10 minutes, and then Oisín has the joyful task of speaking about limitations, lessons learned perhaps. But I think, as Sinéad said, it's important not to lose ourselves into miserablism. It's important to actually understand that there were achievements that happened during this time that we're looking at from 2008 to 2020. And what I kind of want to ask is sort of, why did we win? Because there were important victories that were won. And I'll start off with a bit of, I suppose, scene setting about the state of the left in 2008, just before the recession. Now, you could divide the Irish left into two parts. Firstly, there's the centre left, which is Sinn Féin, the Unions, the Labour Party. And secondly, there's the far left, which would be anarchists, radical Republicans, and Trotskyists. And the book looks at the fortunes of each of these groups. But in 2008, I mean, the latter group, the far left, was sort of irrelevant. They were a collection of very tiny, squabbling groups that didn't really have any influence and very little public awareness as well. And as for the centre left, we're talking about a group that during the Celtic Tiger era was domesticated and very much weakened. If you remember the economic boom of the Celtic Tiger, the political climate was very solidly centre-right. There was pretty universal support for neoliberal politics and no real interest in labour militancy, left-wing politics, or even much state intervention into the economy. So during that period, you had both the Labour Party and Sinn Féin that were trying to position themselves as better managers of, rather than challengers to neoliberalism. So, and if you took a look at the union movement, it had been very much domesticated. Outside the public sector, union membership was in free fall. There's a statistic I have here, which amazed me when we found it out, which was in 1986, you had 300,000 days lost to industrial disputes. By 2007, just before the recession, you had a grand total of 6,038. And so we are talking about a weak and marginal left period during this pre-recession. And this completely changed 2008, 2018. The left won hugely important victories on both the social and economic front. It firstly stopped the imposition of water charges, which would have led to a privatization of water. And secondly, the major thing it did is it overthrew the ban on abortion through this mass grassroots campaign, which Sinead will be able to talk about a lot more than I think myself. And even when the left didn't win, like the failed campaign against household charges, the ongoing campaign for housing, what it did was engage with people's struggles against austerity in a very concrete, a very sustained way, and it mobilized people on this nearly unprecedented scale. And so it was rewarded for this engagement. The Trotskyist parties and Sinn Féin both secured really impressive victories in the local elections and the general elections during this period. And I guess the idea of it being unprecedented is the important thing. Unlike other European countries that had left-wing traditions, strong left-wing traditions, and indeed left-wing governments, Ireland has always been dominated by centre-right parties. But in the 2011 election, the major leading party, Fianna Fáil, collapsed. And for the first time, you had a Social Democratic Party, the Labour Party, becoming the second largest party. Sinn Féin went from electoral success to electoral success, going from winning 4 seats in the Dáil before the crisis to 37 in 2020. And you had the two Trotskyist parties, which have had what's probably the most electoral success. If we're talking about Trotskyist parties, like the most electoral success, I think, of any Trotskyist group in Western Trotskyism, getting 6 seats in the Dáil in 2016, where there was a total of 19 Trotskyists, 9 Trotskyists in the Dáil. So we say, okay, how did this happen? And the obvious answer is the recession. It's difficult to remember the scale and the suddenness of the recession. You had 1 in 7 jobs lost. Unemployment for young people skyrocketed up to 33% in 2012, and you had massive emigration, the likes of which hadn't been seen. Hadn't been seen since the 1980s. Actually, the rate of emigration even exceeded that of the 1980s and the 1950s. And I think the main point about the recession isn't simply that, you had a recession that hit everybody, but also you had a recession that discredited the government, because the government weren't seen as simply, imposing austerity, which is bad in itself, but they were seen of imposing austerity because of what was seen as their own, and when I say their own, I'm talking about the media, the governing classes, economists, unbelievable incompetence, incompetence, also corruption, in fueling a housing and economic bubble, and then bailing out the banks. And in the end, you had these governing authorities not even able to govern. They brought in the EU, the ECB, the IMF to help administer austerity. And one of the things we're talking about doing the timeline, one of the things when reading back over this period, and it's odd to kind of like remind yourself of the period you lived through, was the disbelief and the anger that existed in Ireland in 2009, 2010 at this. And it kind of seemed to a certain extent that Lenin's 2 prerequisites of a revolutionary situation, where you had the governing classes unable to govern as they had previously, and also the people refusing to be governed as they had previously, might be happening in Ireland. Now, obviously it didn't happen. The governing structures were stronger, the release valves of election worked in 2011, and so you had a new government, including the Labour Party, that could be brought in to replace the discredited Fianna Fáil government and to administer austerity, but to do so free of the blame of having caused it. And you also had trade unions being corralled in through various agreements. And by 2013, Ireland had earned a reputation of being good little boys and girls, prepared to take the medicine of austerity calmly, unlike the obstreperous Greeks or something. So in one way this is true, but in one way you can see this period of the early recession as being a sort of space clearing exercise. As the centre-left removed themselves from the field, they were administering austerity, so people increasingly turned to the far left, who were influential in every one of the following campaigns. So originally the abortion rights campaign, which was this mass grassroots campaign to fight for the repeal of the constitutional ban on abortion, were originally organised by anarchists, and it was organised under the anarchist principles of horizontalism and widespread participation. And this movement grew into the largest feminist movement in the history of the state, and of course one of the largest in the Western world in recent decades. And others in the far left were also central for this. Equally, Trotskyists and left independents, they built up campaigns around the country to combat household charges. Now, they failed in these campaigns, but these groups were the nucleus of groups that fought against the privatization the imposition of water charges and privatization of water. And after that, they were moved by far left to move from, well, there was the feeling of, well, we've won water, so what's our next campaign? Housing. And there was the move from the far left to lead the campaign on housing, which the book discusses. We're using a tenants union as the main organizational form. So if we look briefly, so there were victories, I suppose. And if we look briefly about why there were victories, one of the reasons was that the left had the willingness to face problems. You know, I think we talk about in how in some Western countries, the social democratic left was a bit directionless. Its social basis in large manufacturing workforce was sort of seemed to be in terminal decline. Whereas in Ireland, there was not the same disorientation that there might have been in other countries. And the left approached the crisis with specific action repertoires that proved useful in the 2000s. So there were campaign practices around environmental campaigning, trying to get trying to stop a Shell refinery in the West, that proved really useful in providing an activist expertise. It helped enable the organization of the abortion rights campaign as well, and also of the housing movement. And even further back than that, there was a successful struggle against water tax in the 1990s that essentially provided a blueprint for how it could be done again in the 2013-2016 movement, from, you know, not from organizing locally to organizing a non-payment network and so on. And equally important, what we had in Ireland was what we didn't do, which is we didn't adopt the action repertoires of other countries. For instance, we did have some Occupy camps in Ireland in 2011, but square occupations didn't really play the main role they had in other countries. And, you know, considering the outcome of this sort of unfocused and disorganized movements, and how these movements in other countries were either sidelined, as Vincent Bevan talks about in the case of Brazil, how they were taken over by right-wing anti-democratic forces. The failure of spontaneous, loosely organized movements in Ireland was probably no bad thing. So there was, some similarities with, loose organizational practices, but very importantly, there was no similarities between the looser demands that were made in other countries. So I want to just finish off by thinking of the two most important movements in Ireland over the last 15 years. The first one was the movement for abortion rights. Now that was campaigning very explicitly, very unambiguously for the repeal of the Eighth Amendment to the Constitution, very specifically legislation for free, safe and legal abortion. Equally, the movement against the water tax wanted water domestic supply to be publicly owned, financed through general taxation. Everyone in the movement, everyone outside the movement, knew what these movements wanted, knew how they could achieve their demands. And in both cases, they definitively won the core issues of their movements. And I think this offers maybe some contrast with recent movements in other countries, which often have failed to articulate these well-defined short-term goals. So that's a kind of initial exploration of some of the reasons for the successes of the movement. And I'll now turn over to Oisín, who, as economists, with the dismal sciences, will be talking about the limitations of the movements.
Thanks. Yeah, so I'm basically going to take up where David left off. When we were dividing over what we were going to talk about, I told David he can talk about the first 175 pages of the book, and I'd talk about the next 20. But he has somehow managed to spill into some of the things I wanted to talk about already. So, but I'll try not to replicate too much of what he said. So what I want to do is, talk a little bit about this comparison that David has already pointed to between the experience of the left in in the West over the last number of decades and the experience in Ireland. And here there has been, there's points of comparison and points of similarity, but there's also significant points of difference. So, as David pointed out, Ireland is something of an outlier in the West, or in Western Europe, or in Europe, in that it has historically had a relatively weak socialist movement. It is the only, if you exclude, minor principalities and non-democracies in Europe, like the Vatican City and Liechtenstein, the Principality of Liechtenstein. Ireland is the only country in Europe that has never had a socialist or social democratic led government. So that marks it out as quite different. But another way in which it's different, of course, is that in the last decade and a half, the Irish left has gone from a position of relative weakness to a position of relative strength, which contrasts very sharply with other European countries where, of course, the left continues to be in decline. So it's worth just pointing a little bit to these differences. Of course, in Western Europe after the Second World War, through recently established universal suffrage and through the organs of the left, its parties and its unions, participants in the left had a real power and a real ability to affect the future development of society. And through the way in which the once marginal workers' movement and once marginal workers' organizations were incorporated into the administration of capital, these organizations became even more attractive, and more people joined, and more people got involved, and the strength of these organizations continued. But as these organizations took on the governance and administration of capitalism, the question of socialist transformation became increasingly less important. And with this increased administrative focus, the nature of these organizations changed and became increasingly professionalized, increasingly dependent on university-educated experts. And you began to see this kind of shift in the nature of the movement, with the organizational, power being shifted towards these kind of technocratic and professionalized elite, and a decline in power and activism amongst the organizational base. Additionally, of course, from the late 70s until the early 1990s, a further series of events led to this kind of crisis of the left. You can point to the collapse of the Soviet Union, a number of major industrial defeats. If you think of the Patco strike in America, or the miners' strike in Britain, or the Fiat Mafia strike in Italy. Of course, you had financialization, globalization of finance, deindustrialization, offshoring, the increased casualization of work. And so you see this kind of decline of the left. Now, how people responded to this is different in different countries. On the one hand, you have this growth in this kind of professionalized NGO kind of version of the left, what Piketty calls the Brahmin left, and you can kind of see that in people like Blair or Clinton. And on the other hand, you have this the continuation of an increasingly marginal socialist left. Now, for this professionalized centre left of the 1990s, I think at this stage we can just say their project was a complete failure. They promised to oversee an egalitarian form of capitalism, where instead of having this movement based on workers and socialist politics, instead you would have a politics based on the market, accepting the market, having a market-based society, and having individual rights and so on, and this kind of respect of human rights. Well, ultimately, what we've seen over the last couple of decades is an ever-increasing wealth and income inequality, growing political disenfranchisement for large bodies of society. You see stagnant or even falling living standards, and of course, far from recognizing human rights, these very centrists launched a war of conquest in Iraq, killing hundreds of thousands, and today they cheer on a genocide in Gaza. At the margins of the left, the socialists, the socialists kind of continued, and in Ireland we had this marginal activist left, which David points to, but there's other bits of the left that kind of do different things and can respond to this crisis of the left in different ways. You can take care of a number of different kind of approaches. So one is, say, we just need to rebuild it approach. And you see this with, say, organizations like Rifondazione Comunista in Italy, also, which in the late 90s, early noughties was this moment of hope for the left, where, we can rebuild the Italian Communist Party. Or in something like the RMT in Britain, where, if we actually just get back out there and we do militant trade unionism, we can rebuild a trade union. Another approach was kind of coming from, with the reemergence of anarchism and kind of libertarian politics, you saw this emphasis on the development of autonomous workers' movements. You see things like the SUD Solidaire unions in France, the COBAS unions in Italy, things like the reemergence of the IWW, small unions like UVW and IWGB in Britain, and some people put their faith in that, and other people kind of just continue to do what they have always done. Trotskyists continued to, behave as though there was a large socialist or large communist movement that they can be the external opposition to, despite the fact that those movements have disappeared. And some people like Jeremy Corbyn and Bernie Sanders just continue to be, lone voices of socialist politics in the absence of a larger social democratic movement. But what all of these different bits of the left tended to point to was they nearly all accepted that, the movement was in a relatively weak state, that the left was weak, and that workers' organization and workers' mobilization, and that the class struggle had entered a downturn and was in a period of passivity. But what they all held out for was the belief that because of the class nature of capitalist society, that ultimately class struggle would re-emerge. Capitalism would ultimately go back into some form of crisis, and in response to this, you would see the re-emergence of working class self-organization, and this working class self-organization would provide a space for the activity of the radical left. And this is actually an argument that I've seen re-emerge over the last 2 or 3 years, when again the left is in a pretty bad state and the right is in the ascendant. You again are hearing these kind of, the best we can hope for is to wait it out, and we'll see the re-emergence of the left again. Now, of course, what happened is the financial crisis, whether we call it the Great Recession, the Great Financial Crisis, whatever we call it. But this crisis from 2008 onwards was, the largest economic crisis since the Great Depression of the 1930s. It was a huge economic crisis. If we are talking about the objective conditions, the development of capitalism, creating a crisis, this is it. It really happened. And what came out of this was a re-emergence of class struggle, was a re-emergence of social struggle, was a re-emergence of social conflict, like people had anticipated. What, however, didn't happen was the re-emergence of sustainable working class organizations or sustainable organizations of the left, or the re-emergence of this kind of mass membership organization. And the way in which this did and didn't happen in different countries is kind of something that I want to touch on. So in a lot of other Western European countries and in Ireland, what you see is this remarkable ability to mobilize, which is facilitated through the emergence of social media and so on. But these mobilizations have a number of limitations. For one, they do not result in a form of organization, or they don't require a form of organization. To call a demonstration on social media is a lot easier than to call a demonstration if you need to, talk to your workmates or talk to your neighbors or whatever. And indeed, these mobilizations had relatively little penetration both into people's neighborhoods or into their workplaces. We really saw very little workplace organization emerge in the movements since 2008. Now, of course, as in Ireland, this is also what you see. Um, Strikes and boycotts and the kind of traditional repertoires of the radical left do appear, but are very much restricted to the early phases of the crisis. And while you do see these kind of, these sudden mass mobilizations in other countries like, let's say, Occupy or the Puerta del Sol in Spain or occupation of Syntagma in Greece. In Ireland, if we look at this kind of spontaneous explosion, there are significant differences. So one point where you do have this kind of seemingly spontaneous explosion is the first water charges protest in October 2014, where over 100,000 people are on the demonstration. It is far larger than anybody expected. But this differs significantly in that it wasn't this, organization that happened through social media, but rather was a demonstration curated by these large institutional actors, left parties, and unions, and that they managed to. So there's a significant difference there. Another significant difference, of course, is in what David pointed to, which is the ability of the movements in Ireland to articulate clear and coherent demands. So this contrasts quite significantly with other countries which have largely failed to articulate these kind of short-term demands. The movement for abortion rights campaigned explicitly and unambiguously for the repeal of the Eighth Amendment to the Constitution and for the legalization of free, safe, and legal abortion. The movement against the water tax wanted domestic water supply to be publicly owned and financed through general taxation. It was very evident what these movements wanted, and it was very clear how they could be achieved. And this contrasts quite sharply with, say, movements such as Occupy or movements like the movements of the squares in Spain or France or Italy, which often raise demands such as what we want is real democracy, but it's not clear exactly what that means. But whilst these movements did have this ability, one to articulate these demands, and also there was a certain organizational backbone to them, even if they did this. They were doing this mobilization through social media, and in some ways there's some similarities. There is no denying that while these movements did fail to turn into any longer form of organization, the abortion rights campaign, once it had won its demand, uh, continues as a small campaigning group, but any type of larger feminist organization didn't emerge out of it. Likewise, with the anti-water charges movement, um, this didn't turn into, there was attempts to turn it into some form of electoral alliance or some form of new party. This was, essentially a complete failure. And very little organization continued from it. Indeed, even with the electoral success of the left over the last 15 years, a striking difference is that it hasn't seen a significant increase in membership of political parties. So it's quite easy to say, compare Sinn Féin, where membership it has grown in membership quite significantly over the last number of years, but nothing comparable to, say, what was seen with the British Labour Party under Corbyn.
Just get you
If we
to
then look,
a couple of minutes there, Oisín.
yeah. If we then, just ask the question of kind of what has happened to these social movements since 2018, there has been a continuation of these movements, both in the housing movement, also in the impressive movement in solidarity with Palestine. But there's also reasons to temper any optimism. For the first time since the mid-20th century, there's been the emergence of a significant far-right movement in the southern 26 counties. This movement has managed to mobilize significant numbers and has been remarkably persistent, although positively it has been, so far, has failed to make any significant electoral breakthroughs. And if we try to evaluate, where the left is versus, where it is today versus in 2008, in some ways, the left looks quite similar. Whilst we've won significant victories, especially around the water tax and repeal, the left the organized left is still remarkably weak. And there's no major left publications. There's very few left spaces. There's institutionally the left remains quite weak. So that raises kind of big questions about where we can go from here. So I suppose that's kind of what one a question, an open question that kind of comes out of the book is that whilst Ireland's experience, I think, provides some lessons to the left more broadly, both in Ireland and outside. These victories are very fragmented, and it's hard to see, exactly what that means for a longer project of social transformation.
Great. Thanks very much. Thanks to Oisín, and thanks to David as well. So to those of you who are participating in it, just to remind you that you can drop your questions there in the Q&A box down towards the right of your screen. You don't have to ask a long question, even if there's just something you want to maybe know a little bit more about. Feel free to drop it in. There are two questions, both from Edward Malloy, and I think they're both kind of probably directed towards David and Oisín. So I might just ask David, they're quite long there. I'll read them out in a minute, but maybe just have a read of those. And in the meantime, I might just ask Aidan a question, and then we'll come back to David and Oisín. So Aidan, one of the things I suppose that your book grapples with, I suppose, is the bigger question about the role of a revolutionary party, a political party, an organization, whatever you want to call it, within the left. And I suppose there's been that kind of long history of it throughout the 20th century. It kind of reverberates now into the 21st. And I suppose I think one of the things that seems to me is that that was not that too was a question when, at the beginning of the 20th century, about when these mass revolutionary parties that we kind of in the left tend to kind of celebrate so much, when they were emerging. Often the questions I think that you raise about democracy and accountability, the role of the working class, the role of the party in these kind of mass movements, was also something that was kind of widely debated. And we kind of often think, well, it seems to me, in my experience of being in the left, that the question was somehow resolved, as almost like the question was answered and we don't really need to think about it. This is the role of the party. But one of the things for me that's always been very influential is the debate between Lenin and Luxemburg. In and around the kind of the revolution. That it seemed to me that Rosa Luxemburg always seemed to be committed to the idea that to take part in a revolution, you had to open yourself up to what ordinary people, workers, and not just workers, but everybody in that kind of society, to open yourself up to what they think is happening, how they understand what is happening, and what they want, and kind of, I suppose, to open yourself up to the idea that you should be surprised, rather than sort of idea that we have the answer, or we're going to kind of tell you what the answer is. And it seems to me that somehow I suppose because of the particular history of the Russian Revolution and that it's almost like that question got resolved. And if you were part of the left, you were told, well, this is the role of the Revolutionary Party, full stop, rather than what is the role of the Revolutionary Party or the party.
Mm-hmm.
And that was one of the things that seemed to kind of come out to me, particularly in your book as well.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that there's a sort of that debate definitely does stop. At least on the kind of, by definition, if you're a Leninist, you have accepted now that there is a specific kind of Leninist party. Whether or not all Leninist parties are the same is really debatable, but certainly the strand of Trotskyism that I'm looking at is particularly rigid and tends not to engage in a lot of that kind of debate. And there's a lot of when I did interviews with members who, one thing that I found curious is like almost none of them leave and join other Trotskyist parties. They tend to sort of have imbibed that idea that all other Trotskyist parties are wrong. And so they don't, at least the ones I was able to identify and talk to, don't go to other Trotskyist parties in general. But the one or two that did say like it was better when I went to the Socialist Workers, or what was then the International Socialists in Britain that became the Socialist Workers Party, or when I went to the International Marxist Group that Tariq Ali and Ernst Mandel were in. Like at least there was more debate there. So like it's not as sort of, I mean, the WRP are not as emblematic of the entire Leninist left. I think they're just kind of, they're an extreme version of strands that are there in Leninism to begin with. And you know, this is a fairly short book and there's only sort of so much I could say, but if I was to have written like a very Trotskyist style book where it's like 800 pages long and it just goes on and on, one of the things I think I would say now, I mean, in the whatever 6 months since the book has come out, there's a particular figure that I sort of mentioned a few times, and I really liked him as a character when I was writing about him. It was Brian Behan, Brendan Behan's brother, who is a member of the Communist Party in Britain and then joins the Socialist Labour League, has a really dramatic falling out with Gerry Healy, gets beaten up by Healy's supporters. I mean, like badly physically assaulted by them. And then he forms this group called the Workers' Party, not obviously to be confused with the Irish Workers' Party. It's a British-based party and is very like consciously democratic. And my argument about the WRP is ultimately they are a failure. I mean, they're a failure because of their structure. And I like Brian Behan and I like the things he says, but that party also disappeared and is a kind of a failure. I mean, and you can find particular cases of things that the WRP were involved with that they did good in, even despite how nasty their leadership could be. They're really, really good at like promoting Palestinian rights, essentially, way before anyone else on the left in Britain is doing that in a really like serious, coherent way. But the Workers' Party, like this party of Brian Behan, is also a kind of a failure. And I think that's, you know, the history of the left is riddled with parties like the WRP that became like monstrosities and kind of caricatures of themselves. But the history of the left is also riddled with these smaller parties that tried to solve this in a more democratic way and also kind of collapsed in on themselves. Generally didn't become as awful as the WRP became, but did fail to ignite, basically, and fail to take off. And if I was to kind of write a much larger book, I think I'd like to talk about both sides of like why did they both fail to take off? And I think there's lessons to be learned from both of them.
Yeah, yeah. And then maybe this is probably maybe not the fairest question to ask you, but I'm going to ask you anyways. Like, I suppose now going forward, you're in the United States, you have the election of Donald Trump. And I suppose what does that mean for, I suppose, not just the left, but for any progressives who want to organize? Like, what do we still like do party structures, organizations? Like, what are the lessons that you think you can take from your study of Healy?
So I'll just give a very brief answer because I know that there's some questions that David and Oisín were going to address. When Gerry Healy died, there's a memorial service held for him in London, and Ken Livingstone, who had a lot of connections with him, came to the memorial service and he gave this speech where he said, "I have absolutely no doubts that British intelligence was involved in the split in the WRP and like spreading what he seems to be suggesting is spreading false stories about sexual abuse. And later on, people kind of pushed him on this, and there's various correspondence, other people got involved with him of saying, like, trying to kind of back him into a corner, say, like, come on, this wasn't, these weren't fake accusations, these were real accusations. And he, I think, I suspect saw sense a little bit and said, the problem actually is like the type of organization you have and the kind of paranoia it promotes actually makes you really susceptible to state interference. And you need, I think, the thing that I would say that Leninist parties do really well is discipline. And discipline is a good thing. And I think it is a word that might kind of freak out people in certain ways. And I think for good reasons, because too much discipline is not a good thing. But like having a sense of discipline within an organization is a good thing. You just have to balance that with democracy. And I don't know how you do that. I think as a historian, I'm pretty confident in my abilities to say what went wrong. I've no real like claims to make about myself of like what should go right or what should go differently. But you have to balance democracy and discipline. And the WRP was all discipline and no democracy. And too much democracy is also a bad thing. You need some kind of balance, and that's my bigger lesson, I guess.
I like that. Well, discipline and democracy. Very good. Okay, thanks very much, Aidan. So we'll hand over to David and Oisín. So we've got 3 questions. So I'll just start here. So this is from Edward Malloy. How does the North fit into this narrative, if at all? Also big trade union led and successful anti-water charges campaigns and huge public sector struggles. And a second question, I might take both of them together. Also wondering, perhaps connected or not, about the apparently terminal decline of radical left republicanism. Is there a sense that this has created a gap that is tentatively being filled by the far right? There is also the historical anti-fascism of most republicanism that seems no longer to have force. And also more broadly, how does or should partition function in the Irish left imaginary? Okay, so there's a lot of questions there, but maybe you might kind of perhaps each maybe pick one aspect of both of those questions, and then I'll return. There's a third question from Owen McMahon that I'll return to in a minute. And of course, Aidan, if there's anything there that you feel you want to kind of chime in, please feel free.
Do you want to answer anything first, David, or I go ahead?
You can, if you can go ahead and I answer the question maybe on the Workers' Party.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the big, a big red sticker on this book would be, that it's very much about the left in the southern 26 counties and not about the left in the north. And that's like clearly a problem with the book because, of course, for one, it says it's a book about the contemporary Irish left when it's not about all of the contemporary Irish left. But essentially, there's a certain degree to which that's kind of unavoidable. It would be a very different book if we were to write it wouldn't, as the introduction says, it wouldn't be a matter of including a chapter about the North. It would basically be a matter of having 2 chapters on everything, because the experience in the North is quite different to in the South. But yeah, so unfortunately, it's not really covered to a substantial degree. On the question of the decline of radical left republicanism and whether this is being filled by the far right, I don't know if I don't know if that would be true. I think the rise of the far right is a little bit stranger in that I think there's really kind of 3 things kind of coming together to explain it. One of which is people who were pro-life campaigners and kind of a far right Christian element, A third is this kind of international phenomenon of, the online far right and, people getting radicalized online. And then the third thing is COVID. So really before COVID, the far right in Ireland was very, very, very marginal. But the far right basically organized the anti-COVID lockdown protests. And from that went from being, a movement of probably less than 100 or 200 people to being a movement of several hundred people capable of occasionally mobilizing 1 or 2 thousand people and capable of maintaining a sustained movement that would in a continuous way mobilize 50 to 100 people on small protests in a very very sustained way. And I think it's that kind of coming together of those three elements, and that explains it. And also this kind of fact that in the kind of COVID period, it was almost like an incubation period because the left in Ireland was very supportive of the lockdowns, so essentially didn't engage in street activism for a period of about 2 years, which kind of allowed the far right to completely free rein to organize and mobilize. And I think that's kind of the real kind of story of what happened there. I wouldn't, I wouldn't say that the decline of radical left republicanism really plays that much of a role there, um, which is kind of predates, you have in the chapter we talk in some, but not we rather, we have a chapter on republicanism in which the authors talk at some length about a group IRIGI, which was a radical left Republican group, which was quite successful for a number of years, but was already kind of, it still exists, but it's the potential of it kind of breaking through was already kind of well in the rearview mirror by the time that the far right kind of made started to progress in leaps and bounds. So I wouldn't necessarily pull those two things together that closely. I mean, that's my. Well, David, you might disagree with me or say something.
Not really. I mean, one can talk about how the far right has been used against Sinn Féin at the moment, but that's, I think, a different thing. But generally, yeah, I'd agree with you about the issue about partitionism being a problem with the book, but that is because perhaps it's a problem with the Irish left, and not the entirety of course, of the Irish left. If you're taking, let's say, the campaign for repeal and the knock-on campaigning that also happened in the north, that definitely transcended the border. But yeah, in general, I suppose we are talking about you know, different groups responding to different political opportunities and different situations in the 26 counties and the 6 counties. So yeah, while there is some there is some connections, of course. Yeah, we are talking about in some ways very different political situations. And so, yeah, should partition and its ending function in the Irish left imaginary? I'm not sure, but I know that it didn't function much in the Irish left imaginary during this period. So we can read into that what we will. And so to answer Owen's question about the Workers'
Sorry,
Party.
just read it out there because I didn't read that one.
Yes,
Yeah, go ahead. Have you got it there?
oh yeah, I do. Yeah. Hi all, great talk. Definitely including that bit. Can I ask about the Workers' Party and that party of the Irish left? I would include the CPI and whether their fortune during this period can tell us much about where the left is now. I think it does a bit in two ways. I mean, firstly, if we talk about, and I think it is, I think, correct to group them in together. Whether you want to call them the Stalinist left, the tanky left, or the well-organized communist left. It does. I mean, the present situation with the CPI does illustrate how to say, where the left might, where certain parts of the left might be going in relation to the discipline democracy question, and in the importance of having discipline within a political organization, but also the present resurgence, I think we can call it, of the CPI is also showing like a general thing that we were asking, well, why doesn't the left maintain organizational persistence? In certain cases, it does. And if we talk about the CPI, which has achieved self-funding, which also maintains its own physical space, this is an important, this is an important aspect of, keeping on, which they've managed to do. But it also might, as you say, the present good fortunes of it, increased success of it, may illustrate the kind of moving away from the anarchist left, which was, I wouldn't say dominant, but a hugely important part of the left just prior to the recession, to a more formally organized part of the left. The thing about the Workers' Party is also interesting, because that achieved a resurgence during this period as well. And the reason for the resurgence, it was especially after the collapse of the United Left Alliance, the ULA, which had been this effort to have a kind of broad left group, which included Trotskyist parties, the Socialist Party and the Socialist Workers' Party were the main part of this, but also included a lot of members of the independent left. And what the Trotskyist parties decided to do was to promote their own organizations, rather than, thinking that this united body, the United Left Alliance, wasn't coherent enough in order to serve as a vehicle for social change. And so this led to a lot of, homeless, you could say, independent left-wingers who were searching for this kind of vehicle to make a broad left movement. The idea of moving into the Workers' Party, because a lot of them did move into the Workers' Party, and a lot of them actually moved from, incidentally, from the Workers' Solidarity movement, which was at this stage sort of collapsing, moved from that group towards the Workers' Party, as a way of seeing this as a vehicle to build this broad left grouping. Now, the fact that it didn't become this broad left grouping, that's significant, of course, but I think equally significant is the aim there was not, to have another small faction along with the other small faction, but to create a maybe authentically social democratic left-wing party, which, it was part of left-wing imaginary of the time. So I think, the attempt to make the Workers' Party that way showed, in a certain way, the optimism, for want of a better word, but also the attempts to win, which was characteristic of that period.
Maybe I could just ask you both then one final question. So obviously your book was published just before the last election. Has that changed any of your conclusions, or do you think maybe you have some advice for the Irish left, on the basis of your kind of looking at, let's say, more than a decade, 15 years?
God, yeah, you do ask the hard questions. I'll give you that. I don't know. I mean, I don't think, we were writing the book on the assumption there would be a centre-left government with Sinn Féin in it. That was a kind of common assumption until recently, when that was kind of clear this was almost definitely not going to happen.
That assumption,
What?
I think we all share that assumption.
Yeah. So I don't know if I don't think we would have massively changed our conclusion, which was the idea that mobilization without organization would, is detrimental to the left. And the conclusion is that the left has to interrogate, itself, and like interrogate why there's a lack of enthusiasm to build these, spaces that allows organizational persistence. And this goes beyond simply the immediate task of, the need to tackle the far right, which is, I suppose, one of the immediate tasks for the left now. But I don't know if we would have changed that much, to be honest. Oisín.
Oisín, do you want to come in there?
Yeah. Well, yeah. The yeah, I think we sent the book to the publisher in July when the local election results had come through. So I think it was already clear that we I think there's a few things where we changed words like likely outcome to hopeful outcome and things like that. Um, so yeah, but I mean I don't think there's a huge amount that we would change, or even a huge amount of reasons to change anything. Um, we've got a little bit of yeah, kind of pushback that we are, overly optimistic, which is yeah, my given my opinions on the left is surprising. But I think if you do look at it just in this long-term time frame, we are in a very different position in 2025 to where we were in 2007. There was, people are saying, oh, after the last election, it was really bad because now we don't have a left-led government. Nobody in 2007 even raised the possibility of a left-led government. It was completely and utterly off the table. There was no road to that. When people in Paul Dillon's chapter, he describes people in the Labour Party in 2010 um, beginning to say, oh, actually, what we should be working towards is making the Labour Party the main opposition party in order to work towards, a left-led government. People treated them as completely ridiculous. It was a completely ridiculous possibility that was completely impossible in Ireland, that was never viable. Today, people go, oh, it's a total disaster because you haven't achieved it. So, I think what we're trying to, I don't think we're optimists, but we are trying to point to like a real shift that has happened. And also trying to point to, as David said, this. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily put in quite as prescriptive the way that David put it, that the left needs to address this issue of um, mobilization without organization. But I think it is something that the left needs to understand and needs to recognize that this is a phenomenon. This is this thing that uh, not only happens in Ireland, but is kind of something that is a phenomenon for the left across the Western world, and has been, for a while now. The way in which social struggles happen and the way in which social conflict happens looks very different to how it appeared, between uh, while the Soviet Union existed, and that, kind of the you know the short 20th century. So yeah, I think that's that kind of observation, the of the nature of the left, the observation that the Irish left has changed a lot and is now in a much stronger position, and also this observation that actually there were these major struggles that happened that are worth remembering and are worth incorporating into our understanding of Irish politics. I'll just say one final thing, which is that, you know, uh, everybody kind of speaking at this as, I think, either a socialist or very sympathetic towards socialist politics. Um, but in I, the way in which in Ireland Irish politics is talked about, those views are very much outside of kind of acceptable discussion. If we look at, RTE, the main national broadcaster, if we look at the Irish Times, if we look at the Irish Independent, essentially nobody who represents the politics that you find in Sinn Féin or in any of the parties to the left, in the repeal movement, in the water tax movement, essentially nobody talks about these movements as though they're a serious part of Irish political life. It is still treated as though the left in Ireland is this marginal phenomenon, And I think one of the things that I hope will come out of the reception of the book, I mean, I'm not expecting any big things, but that some people begin to go, actually, if we want to understand the politics of Ireland over the last 15 to 20 years, a big part of that is the fact that the Irish left is a significant social force, has been over the last 15 years.
Yeah, great. Thanks very much, Oisín. It's a really great summary. Aidan, I'll maybe just give you a final opportunity. Is there anything you want to add to any of those points that have come up, or anything you wanted to say that you didn't get an opportunity to say?
No, I'm happy to just kind of leave it at that. I think, you know, Oisín said he's not an optimist, and I kind of want to say, but that's not a bad thing. It is okay to be optimistic as well as being pessimistic, or to be kind of, to sort of inhabit the realism in between. Which I'm going to just end with that comment, basically.
I think that's very good advice. So I'd like to thank our three panelists, Aidan, David, and Oisín, I think, for what's been a really fascinating discussion, and to thank them for all their efforts and for I think the really important work that they've done. As Oisín said there at the end, you know, the Irish left often doesn't get a look into kind of mainstream discourse. And I think both of these books are a really kind of important documentation of our history and of the things, of our failures, but also of the things that we have achieved. And I think that's really important as we kind of enter into a really urgent phase in like the history of humanity, that we are kind of in these kind of vital moments, and there's really important lessons to be learned there. So thanks to everybody who asked a question. Thanks to everybody who came along and listened. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. Good night.